Welcome, second graders, to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center. I'd like to give a special welcome to the second graders at Southwood Valley Elementary in College Station ISD. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I wish you could be here in person, but since you can't, we're going to do our best to make you feel like you're here during a virtual field trip experience this morning. If you are watching this and have not registered for this field trip yet, you can still do that by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC register to get yourself or your class registered for this field trip. We just use that information for our attendance purposes. And this morning's field trip is going to be about properties of freshwater and saltwater. During this virtual field trip, students will discover that the natural world includes earth materials. Students will observe and compare the properties of natural sources of freshwater and saltwater. So we're going to start things off by exploring natural sources of freshwater with Miss Nash. Next, we're going to explore natural sources of saltwater with Mr. Ramirez. Third, we're going to explore the color and clarity of water with Mr. Monroe. And last, you're going to see an investigation called the melting investigation with Mrs. Fuller. While we're doing all of that, you can ask us questions, and we encourage you to ask questions. But since this is a virtual field trip, the way you ask a question is you'll need to go to www.tiny.cc/EEC-question-answer. And once you get there, you'll fill out a super short form to ask us any questions you have related to freshwater or saltwater or both. And you can ask as many questions as you like, and we will do our best to answer all of them in the time that we have with you this morning. So let me stop sharing my screen here and turn things over to Miss Nash, who's going to get us started off with natural sources of freshwater.
Good morning. Welcome to my classroom. So today we're talking about water, and we all need water. All the animals, all the plants, we all need water. Really important for life on our planet. So today we're talking about the properties of natural sources of fresh water. So fresh water is any water that's not in the ocean. It's not salt water or in a salty lake, not salty. The properties, what is up? Well, first, what is a source? A source means where it comes from. Where did that water come from? Properties are things about that water that things we could describe. So properties might be color and clarity. You're going to be looking at that later. The chemical makeup, the pH, also the temperature, is it contaminated, it's safe to drink. All those things are things we call properties, things we can, words and things we can use to describe that water. Now, today, sadly, you can't be here with us. But when I was thinking about this program, I thought, well, if they were here, what would we do? We'd talk for a little bit about water, and then we would go out for a walk and see what we could find. So let's go out for a walk with me and see what we can find around here in terms of water. There we go. So actually this was last Sunday when it snowed. Did you see that snow? It was so beautiful. I tried to take a picture, but it couldn't really take a good picture. And sadly, at my house, it all melted. The ground was too warm. And so I saw all that water on the plants. Okay. So the plant roots absorb some of it, but some of it collects. Okay. It does not get absorbed by the ground. And I had a little puddle. A puddle is a little body of water. Now, when I went for my walk here, I saw these puddles, bigger puddles. You could splash in those if you were here. Where did those puddles come from? Well, they came from that tank, you see, that animals drink out of. But the water, see that hose? Can you see the hose there? It came from the windmill, and that windmill is using the wind to turn the blades of the windmill and pump. We dug a well, and we're pumping water from underground, and that's called groundwater. And it's really good water that comes out of our windmill, nice and clear and not as far as we've tested it a couple of times. It's safe to drink, certainly for the animals. That water is there like in an underground pond or pool or even sometimes a river. And it filtered down through the ground and collected underground. And we can pump that up, and it's called groundwater. I walked along and I found our first little pond. And it was almost dry just a couple of weeks ago, but then it rained quite a bit and it filled back up. And these ponds are filled with just what we call runoff from rain. So they're down in the bottom of kind of a hole there, and we dig a hole, and then when it rains a lot, the ground will soak up all the water, and some of it will run off into that pond. You can see the edge nice and muddy with animal tracks all around. And here's where it was. See that ring on the edge? That shows where the water was already evaporating. I walked down a little farther and I found our lake. We have a small lake here, more water. And again, this lake is filled with just runoff from rain. We don't have any creeks or rivers running into our lake. It fills up just with rainwater. And then if it doesn't rain, there's no more water at all. Just in the summer, that lake dried up completely. So all the fish and everything else that was there had to either die or find a new place to live. Now all our lakes here in Texas, except for one out in East Texas, are man-made. We don't have any natural lakes. Okay, they're dammed up streams, rivers, or just runoff areas like this one. But there are other places that freshwater comes from, springs. And if you live in Oak Cliff, like where I grew up, we used to go to Kidd Springs Park. That's it on the right-hand side. And there was a spring there. When I was really young, they were still swimming in that spring. They made a pool and people could swim in it. They don't let you do that anymore. But that's a spring, a natural spring where water comes out from that groundwater I talked about. In some places, that water comes back up to the surface in a spring. And those are places where we have really amazing water. It's usually clear and clean and cold. And on the left-hand side, you see a place called Big Springs, and that's a new place that's being protected down here in the southeast part of the county, a Big Spring. And then, of course, my favorite place in the world is Barton Springs down there in the lower right in Austin. If you go to the hill country, there are lots and lots of amazing springs. Some of them make like a river. They come out of the ground like a river. And Barton Springs is very cold and clean and just beautiful. Now here in Texas, our rivers really aren't very big except when it floods. So on the left-hand side, we see our Trinity River going through that big Trinity forest there. And it's not very big, it's really muddy. Okay, a lot of silty runoff in it. But then on the right-hand side, you see what happens when there's a lot of rain and it floods. In other parts of the country, rivers are bigger than that in normal times. And then on the bottom, when I Googled Trinity River, I got that picture too. That's in California. It's another river. Look how different that one is. It's coming from the mountains. It's running fast and probably very cold and clear. Stop sharing, and I want to have a few little challenges for you. What I'd like you to do is go take a walk in a park. Find a park or maybe even just a schoolyard. And you can find a puddle with a little thing of water, a pond or a lake, or maybe even a creek or stream, and do some observation. What do you see? What do you notice? You can draw a picture, and then you can think about what is the source? Where did it come from? Where did that water come from? At Kidd Springs, the name tells you it's a spring. It's coming from underground. The source, is there a creek that runs into it? Like go to White Mouse Lake, there are lots of creeks that come into that lake, and that's where that water comes from. What does the water look like? What color is it? Can you tell if it's deep or not? Do you see any signs of animal life? And you see a lot of trash around it or evidence of pollution? So we need to take care of our fresh water because that's the only water we can really drink, and the animals can drink too. The fresh water on our planet is a really tiny drop in the giant ocean of water that we have. We can't drink that salt water, and the plants can't really use it either. Most plants can't. So we really need to take care of our freshwater and try not to contaminate. So if you have any questions, you can ask Mr. Groton. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nash. The question that came in was, in College Station, where does the water we use come from? And since I'm not from, I had to look that up because we live up here in the Dallas area. But College Station pumps water from deep wells located on city-owned land over the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer in the Carrizo-Sparta and Cimbroso sand formations. So you get your water from an aquifer. In Dallas, we get our water from reservoirs mostly. All right, now we are going to explore sources of salt water with Mr. Ramirez.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning about salt water and where it comes from. So before we can understand what salt water is, let's talk about what exactly is salt. So you guys are probably familiar with salt. The science word for salt is sodium chloride, and it's a mineral that is very important to both humans and to animals as well. So you guys might be familiar with things like table salt. So table salt is actually mined from underground. I like sea salt. So that's that nice, coarse, big chunks of salt. And this one says it's well known for its bright white color, subtle flavor, light texture. And this sea salt has been harvested from the pristine waters of the Mediterranean Sea. I also have another type of salt. This is Peruvian pink salt, and it has definitely a pinkish color to it. And this one comes from the Peruvian Andes. It's a source of high quality salt. So there's some very different and interesting sources of salt as well. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys, and we're going to look at some examples of where our salt water comes from. So let me get that screen share started, and then we'll take a look at our presentation. So here's a close-up microscopic image of some of those salts that I showed you earlier. So if you look at this picture, can you make out the 3 different salts I showed you? Can you describe some of the properties? Maybe think about how do you think they might feel, describe the different sizes that you see. And I know you aren't able to be with us today, but maybe at home, you probably have salt at home. So think about, how does that salt smell? How does it taste? Maybe look on the container of the salt and see, where does that salt come from? Is it coming from a sea? Is it coming from a landmine? So think about that when you guys go home today, and look through your cupboards to see if you have various different kinds of salt. So I'll give you guys just a second to take a look at that image and make some descriptions and observations about what you guys are seeing. Now, I will let you guys know those big chunks are actually the Peruvian pink salt. And then the smaller, tiny ones that kind of look like little cubes, that is the table salt. So you can see they look different in their crystal structure as well. In our next slide, we're going to talk about what are sources of water. So really quickly before I show you, go ahead and think about, what are some sources of salt water that you can think of? So think about that in your mind. And then I'm going to show you guys an example, a flyover of our planet, and we'll look at some of those sources. So let me take you guys to Google Earth, and you can actually use Google Earth for free by yourselves at school or at home as well. So as we explore our planet Earth, I want you guys to think about, can you name any salt water sources as I take you through this virtual tour of planet Earth? So as I scroll through the planet, be thinking about naming some of the salt water sources. So I'm going to take you around. See if you can see and name any salt water sources. Now, I will give you guys a hint. Some common saltwater sources would be things like seas and oceans. So as we're scrolling through, can you guys see any seas in our diagram here? So I can see the Red Sea over here by Egypt. We have the Arabian Sea. We also have the Java Sea over here. So seas are just, they're smaller than oceans, and they're usually surrounded mostly by land, and then they have an opening. An ocean is much larger than a sea, and that's the difference between a sea and an ocean. So just look at our sea here. It's surrounded by some land. We have another sea over here. It has land on this side. We're going to continue scrolling, and you guys can shout out some of the saltwater sources that you guys can find as we scroll through planet Earth. We also have the South China Sea, and again, you can see this sea is partially surrounded by land, which again makes it different from an ocean. We actually have quite a few seas over here. I'm starting to see an ocean. Hopefully you guys can spot it too. We are now over the North Pacific Ocean, and oceans house most of our salt water. And that's a vast ocean. We also have the South Pacific Ocean. We're coming around the corner. We're almost to where we live in North America. So here we are in North America. Some of the oceans surrounding North America, we have the Atlantic Ocean over here, the North Atlantic Ocean, and then we also have the North Pacific Ocean. Those are great sources of salt water. And let's see if it will actually let me zoom in so that we can see the beach. So if you've ever been to a beach, have you accidentally gotten salt water in your mouth? Think about, what did it taste like? So I'm going to see if it's going to let us zoom in just a little bit closer to the ocean. And here we are, a nice, wonderful view of the beach. Again, the beach is a great habitat for lots of different animals and organisms as well. So I'm going to go ahead and take us out of Google Earth, but that's something that you guys can explore on your own as well. And let's go back to our presentation. So we learned that some sources of salt water. We saw our seas and our oceans. We also have something very interesting called salt lakes, and we'll look at an example of one of those salt lakes in just a second. But salt water is water that has much more salt than fresh water. So fresh water does have a small amount of salt in it. And again, our salt water is mostly found in our oceans and our seas. And there are very few saltwater lakes. So why do you think that is? Oceans also hold most of Earth's water. So do you think that the majority of water here on Earth is drinkable? Why do you think it is, or why not? And then also be thinking about water conservation. So here's a good example of a saltwater lake. Everyone always talks about the Great Salt Lake of Utah, but here in Texas, we actually have our own, and it's called the La Sal del Rey, and it means the King's Salt. And it was named from Spanish explorers. So they actually found this salt lake, the Spanish explorers, and they were wanting to mine that salt to bring it back to their king in Spain. And this is actually one of 3 naturally occurring salts in South Texas. So you can see on our little map, it's right over here down toward the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see just how salty that water is. And in many times, the salt concentration of these salt lakes, it's much more heavily salted than the ocean itself. So this is actually sitting on top an estimated 4 million tons of salt. So that's a lot of salt in that lake. And we call these hypersaline lakes. That just means, hyper means a lot. Think about if someone calls you, you're super hyper, you have a lot of energy. So hypersaline lakes have a lot of salt. So saline means salt. And it is 7 times saltier than ocean water. So this again is a very hypersaline lake here as well. So let's look at another example. We also have what are called brackish waters. Now, brackish waters are a little bit different. So brackish waters occur when fresh water, we learned about earlier with Miss Nash, meets the seawater. And the most extensive brackish waters are very interesting habitats for a lot of different animals. So when we have fresh river water meeting seawater, we have what's called an estuary. So that's where a river meets a sea or ocean. And then you can see a very unique organism here, the Gulf toadfish. And these can be found here in Texas estuaries. And it's a very interesting organism. It's well camouflaged for those rocky estuaries, and it can survive in a wide range of saline conditions. And then we talked about a couple of words here. So we know fresh water does have a small amount of salt in it. So it's usually less than not even 1%. So it's 0.05% of salt concentration. Brackish waters have anywhere up to 3% salt concentrations. Saline water or seawater has about 3 to 5% salt concentrations. And then we have what are called brine waters, and they have more than 5% and upwards of 28 to 30% saltwater concentration. So we can have various levels of salinity, and that will determine what type of water we call it, whether it's freshwater, brackish water, or saline or brine waters. And then here's just a little video for you guys. We're gonna play the video, observe some of the things that you're seeing. So what are some things that you see? What do you wonder? And then it's important to note that water is a natural resource. So that means it's something that occurs naturally in nature that we use. So as you watch the video, be thinking about how is water used by people, how is it used by animals, and how is it used by plants? So what makes water such an important natural resource? And not just fresh water. We're also talking about salt water too as an important natural resource. Oops, so let me see, oops. Let me get that video playing. There we go.
Was born and raised in Houston, so I thought I had a pretty good idea of what our coast was all about. But when you see it all from above, you see how intertwined man is with his environment. How we've left our mark on virtually every aspect of the coast. And how special the areas are.
So we can actually use water for hydroelectric power. I'm gonna fast forward. There's some interesting wildlife that depend on our salt water. And these video shots are taken along the Texas coastline. I'm going to fast forward it just a little bit. So look at the different shapes that the water takes. I'm going to pause it there. What do you think is happening in that image? So here we see a very distinct barrier, and it's a distinct line where two bodies of water meet. So we have the ocean, the salt water, meeting fresh water from a river. So each body of water has its own temperature, salinity, or salt levels, and density. And that's why we're seeing that kind of dividing line. But at that dividing line, the salt and the fresh water is actually mixing below the surface. So while a person on a boat is not able to see that water mixing, underneath, there's actually a really cool science phenomena happening between that water mixing. So I don't have time to show you the whole video and the science behind it, but again, this is from Texas Parks and Wildlife, and it does a pretty good overview of some of the water sources here in Texas. So the brown murkiness of that fresh water, so the fresh water here is the murky one, and that is because it has a lot of that sediment from the rivers. And then the fresh water will actually rise up and over the denser salt water, creating that boundary that you're seeing. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and I'm going to stop that video there. And then let's go really quickly to just a little bonus slide. The Dead Sea. So everyone knows the Dead Sea as one of the saltiest sea or saltwater lakes. It's about 34% salt. It is 10 times saltier than seawater. And this one is a cool example because salt water affects the buoyancy of objects. So because the density of the salt water, because it's more dense, swimmers are more buoyant in salt water than they are in regular fresh water. So people can actually float rather easily. You don't really have to know how to swim, because you will actually naturally just float because of the high concentration of salt in the Dead Sea. And you can repeat a similar experiment at home if you just have some glasses of water and you have one with just regular water from the tap. You can fill another glass with just a little bit of salt and see what happens. And then you can fill another glass with a lot of salt and make it a super salty concentration. And then you can place an egg in each of those glasses and see whether they sink or float. And then you can describe what you're seeing and why that's happening. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So I'm going to stop my screen share. And again, most of our salt water is coming from our oceans, our seas, and just a small amount is actually coming from our salt lakes. So we're going to pass it back to Mr. Broughton, and he's going to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ramirez. The question that came in was, do we need salt water to live? And yes, we do. Now, you cannot drink salt water. That would make you sick. But we still need salt water to live because so much plant and animal wildlife live in salt water, especially in the oceans. And we do need oxygen to breathe. And actually, a lot of times when you think about where oxygen comes from, you think plants like trees and grass and plants that live on land, but actually 50 to 80% of the oxygen that we use on Earth comes from plants in the oceans. So we definitely do need salt water to live. All right, now we're going to look at the color and clarity of water with Mr. Monroe.
Okay, good morning, second graders. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be looking at water color and clarity. In fact, is pure water clear? Well, pure water would be something like drinking water. It appears to be very clear, but it's not really clear. Because if I was to take this glass of drinking water out into the sunlight and hold it up to the sunlight, we might see a little light bluish tint that would appear in this water. So it's not really clear. It has that slight bluish tint to it. Now, in the natural world, you often see water that definitely is not clear. For example, I know that this is drinking water and I feel comfortable in taking a drink of it. Would I drink water that would be of this color? I'm afraid not. I'd be a little nervous about drinking some water if I know it's supposed to be water and it looked like this. No, no, no. So we know that water can take on a variety of colors. And there are several reasons why that can happen. In fact, I have a flask, and earlier in your virtual field trip lessons, you heard Miss Nash, and she showed you a picture of our pond. This flask has a sample of our pond water in it. And if I hold this close, you will see that it is not really clear. It has a little green, some green particles in it. And I will tell you, it will give this water a greenish color. And what's in it is an organic material called green algae. And we have some of that in our pond. Now, green algae is considered to be very important to aquatic systems unless you get too much of it, simply because that green algae does the same thing that plants do for us on land. It's a food source for some of the aquatic organisms. And then, because it's green in color, it also goes through the process of photosynthesis, just like land plants go through to make their own food. And the byproduct that comes from them making their own food through photosynthesis is oxygen, which is needed by us. So it gives it a greenish color. Now, another reason why water can have a different color, and I think you heard Ms. Ramirez refer to that, freshwater, surface water, usually takes on the color of the surroundings because our bodies of fresh water, like rivers and lakes and ponds and puddles, that are scattered around, for that water level to be up or for that water to be on the surface, it depends on precipitation. but it also depends on something that we call runoff. Now, our ponds out here, the land around those ponds are sloped off. Even man-made lakes, which we refer to them as reservoirs, depends on precipitation. And some of the surrounding land also runs into those ponds or those bodies of water. And we call that a type of erosion, the transporting of material by erosion agents like wind and water and gravity. Now, listen, guys, there's a river that separates the state of Texas and the state of Oklahoma. The state of Oklahoma is my home state. I'm a Sooner. And the name of that river, it is called the Red River. And anytime that you're traveling up Interstate 35 going into Oklahoma, or maybe even other highways that may take you from Texas into Oklahoma, you cross this river, and if you look closely, you'll notice that the water is a reddish brown. But also, if you look at the land that's making up the banks of that river, and even underneath that river, the soil is a reddish brown. In this bucket, I've got some of that original Oklahoma soil that you could find around the Red River. And I'm going to scoop a little of it out. And as you can see, it is a reddish brown, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I have a beaker here that has a little bit of water in it, and I'm going to put this teaspoon of this red soil in it and give it a stir. You know, rivers, they're actually what we call lactic bodies of water. That means that the water is moving or traveling. And as that water flows down that river, guess what? It's just like stirring up the sediments, which are bits and pieces of the surrounding land. And look what we've got. We've got a reddish brown water, okay? And that sediment that's in there is giving it, and it's giving it that color. Now, the other day I took some soil around, samples from around the center here, and it was a dark brown, almost a black, because we're part of the Blackland Prairie up here. But I am going to mix something a little different today. This is a little bit of what we call Eagle Ford shale. Now, Eagle Ford shale is gray in color. And we find a lot of this down around Midlothian and in Ellis County. And it's also used in the making of a product called concrete or cement. Now, I'm going to take a teaspoon of these little pieces of sediment and put it in this beaker and stir it up. So a pond or a lake that would have this around the edge of that lake, or around the land around that lake, as it rains, it would wash some of this in, and look what color the water would be. Kind of a grayish color. So there again, the surrounding land and what's underneath the body of water can really impact or influence the color of that particular water, that body of water, okay? Now, often I've had students ask me why sometimes the ocean appears to be blue. One of the answers that is given is that the ocean water reflects the color of the sky. We know that our sky appears to be blue, right? And unless the clouds are there, that could very well be true, that there's a reflection of the sky in the ocean water. But the real reason that ocean water sometimes will appear blue is based on the same thing that the formation of a rainbow is based on. Natural light coming from the sun, students, when it's broken down into its basic light waves or light beams, it's a variety of colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. We see those colors in natural white light. Well, take, for example, the formation of a rainbow. as it rains, when the raindrops kind of slow up, and it is said that when you see a rainbow, the rain is just about gone. That means the rain is slowed down. When that natural light penetrates those little water droplets that we call rain, guess what? It's breaking those natural light beams down into the basic colors that you see in the rainbow. Well, the same thing happens in the ocean. When those natural light beams or light waves hit the ocean, and the ocean is much vast, much larger than just that little rain shower that's going on. That red, orange, yellow, green, guess what? When it hits the water molecules, the particles of water, they absorb it. They take it in. But the blue, indigo, and violet, they get all scattered out and they mix together. And guess what? They form blue. Now, that would probably be up close to the surface. The deeper you go into the ocean, where sunlight cannot penetrate, guess what happens? The darker it gets, and even it becomes so dark it appears to be black. Now, that kind of explains how water can be different colors, either through organic and sediment materials being in the water, or simply because of the effects of light rays or light waves being broken down and changed into one solid color. Now, clarity, the clearness of the water. We can see that this water is not very clear, right? We also can look at this pond water and see that it's not really clear, okay? There's a word that we use out here for clarity, and that is the word turbidity. If you were out here on a field trip with us and we were studying the water, we would test the clarity of our water in the pond and the lake. It's called turbidity. How clear the water is very important to the aquatic organisms that live in that body of water. Also, if it's like this, guess what it affects also? The plant life in that body of water. Because we know that plants need sun, right? You know, if algae tried to grow in this, especially in a lower depth, it would really have a problem because algae needs sunlight, okay? Now, one way that we measure clarity in our ponds is this. We use an instrument called a turbidity tube. And in the bottom of the turbidity tube, if you look, try to get that where you can see it, there's a black and white design. And what we do, we go out into the pond, we take a water sample, we fill it up so far, and then we look down through the tube to see if we can see that black and white design. Now, just to show you, for example, I'm going to take a little bit of water. I'm going to pour down the tube. This is just regular clear water. And I'm going to adjust the camera just a little bit and see if you can see that black and white design. And I'm sure you can. It's there. That black and white design is down there. We can see it pretty good. Now I'm going to pour a little of this red water, reddish brown water down there. Do you think this might affect the fish that live there? I'm sure. You know, fish have to breathe oxygen or take oxygen from the water by using their gills, which the water passes through their gills for them to extract oxygen from. This may not be good for fish, right? Can we see the black and white design now? No. So the turbidity is very poor. Clarity is very poor. So that's how clarity really, it indicates clearness of the water. Now, students, I would much rather drink water like this than drinking water like this. Students, listen, I hope you have a good rest of the virtual field trip, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Broughton. So if any of you have any questions, feel free to ask them. All right, Mr. Broughton.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. The question that came in was, how many different colors can water be? And water can be many different colors depending on what is in that water. So it can be different colored soil, but it also could be different types of algae. So if you want to see some really interesting colors of water, research algae blooms. Algae oftentimes is green, but it can be practically all the colors of the rainbow depending on what kind of water it's living in and what the temperature of that water is. So if you want to see something pretty interesting, research algae blooms. All right, now we're going to do the investigation, which is the melting investigation with Mrs. Fuller.
Good morning, boys and girls. We're going to talk about whether a salt affects the melting of ice. So we're going to do a couple of things here to put our thinking caps on. So let's first make a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an informed prediction of what's going to happen. So do you think that the salt will affect the melting of ice? So we're going to start first with a block of ice. Now, you know that we had cold weather earlier this week, and how many of you saw the men treating the streets? Well, they were putting some sort of salty substance on the streets to help the ice melt. So I'm putting this on. We'll look at it at the end to see what happened. I want you to predict, make a hypothesis of what will happen to this block of salt. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to try, let me lower this a little bit so you can see it. We've got 2 beakers of ice here and 2 beakers of tap water. This is plain tap water. I'm going to put a drop of blue color in it so you can tell the difference between it and the other one. And in this one is tap water that has 3 tablespoons of sugar dissolved in it. Now, of these 2 kinds of water, the plain tap water and the tap water with salt dissolved in it, which one of these 2 beakers do you think the ice will melt first or more quickly? So we're going to pour both of these over here. Got to be careful not to overrun them. Okay. This one needs a little bit more. Okay, now we're going to move these to the back and you can make your prediction. Will the blue one melt faster or the clear one? The clear one's the one that has 3 tablespoons of salt. Okay, now you need to know that water, just plain water, is considered the universal solvent. What that means is more things will dissolve in it than any other substance. The stuff that gets dissolved in it is called the solute. In this case, the solute is salt, sodium chloride, NaCl. You may have seen that before in your science books. Okay, so fresh water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Salt water freezes at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So the salt changes the freezing temperature of the water. Now, we're going to do another one. Miss Ramirez told you to try a little experiment. While we're waiting for these 2 to work, we're going to try a little experiment with an egg. Now, I'm going to bring my lab assistant over here. Come here. My lab assistant laid this egg. This morning, her name is Lauren. She's an Americana chicken, and she lays an egg for me every day. We're going to see if this egg will float in regular tap water. So let's put that in. Oh, no, it doesn't float. The reason why it won't float is the egg is more dense than the water itself. So let's put her down. And then remember what we said. That was the water cycle that just hit the ground. Remember what we said a minute ago? There you go. About water being the universal solvent. Well, that means things will dissolve in it, but will it make it more dense? So let's try and see. So here's a tablespoon. I'm going to put maybe 5 tablespoons of water, excuse me, 5 tablespoons of salt in this tap water. That was 3. Here's 4. And here's 5. And I'm going to stir it up real quick and see that sodium chloride, that salt, dissolve in this water. Now, even though the water cycle's on the floor, we know that when evaporation takes place in the water cycle, the salt does not go up in the sky. The salt stays in the ocean. So when evaporation takes place, only the water molecule itself rises up as water vapor. It doesn't take anything that's dissolved in it with it. So when we get rain, rain is fresh water. It's pure water. All right, now we have Lauren's egg again, and we're going to give that just a second. Let's see if her egg will float. Well, not quite. So maybe we need to fish that egg out and see, add maybe 1 more tablespoon of salt to make the salt water more dense. So add 1 more. Here we go. We're going to stir it again. Now, the experiment we're doing with the melting waters, I'm going to explain that to you real quickly while this dissolves. And it essentially, the fresh water, the cold parts down here at the bottom, but as the ice melts, it starts a convection current. Ms. Ramirez made reference to the convection current in the oceans and how important it is in controlling weather. Well, actually the same thing goes on in a lava lamp or in this little thing right here. But because this one is so cold, remember, salt water freezes at 28 degrees as opposed to 32 here. This is gonna melt a little bit faster. So, and that convection current is also going to add to it. Another thing you need to know about ice that you see on the ocean, the ice that comes from icebergs, those are calved, they're separated from a big glacier, those are fresh water. The sea ice that you see on TV in the Arctic, that is got some salt in it, but a very, very little amount of salt in it. As a matter of fact, some people have even broken off chunks and melted it and drunk it. So it has some salt in it, but not a lot. All right, let's try Lauren's egg 1 more time and see if this water with the salt in it, oh, looky there. It didn't sink as fast, but it's still at the bottom. Well, no, it's kind of floating up a little bit. So you might want to try this experiment at home, trying different amounts of salt in the water to see at what point the egg will float. All right, and I'm out of time. So let's look at our other 2 long-term experiments here. And we're going to look at the block of ice. And this little tray it's in is filling up with water really quickly. And you can see the salt there on the top. And then these 2, I'll let you judge. It looks to me like there is more solid ice in the salt one than there is in the freshwater one. And 1 more thing about water is when it freezes, it expands. So it gets bigger, and that's why ice will float on water. It's less dense than water. If you have any other questions about salt and water and freezing, Mr. Broughton will be glad to answer those for you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fuller. I'm going to share my screen here one last time to do a quick recap of what we did today. So today's field trip was titled Properties of Freshwater and Saltwater. During this virtual field trip, students discovered that the natural world includes earth materials. Students observed and compared the properties of natural sources of freshwater and saltwater. So first we explored natural sources of freshwater with Ms. Nash. Then we explored natural sources of saltwater with Mr. Mirez. Then we looked at color and clarity of water with Mr. Monroe. And you just saw the melting investigation with Mrs. Fuller. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate you taking the time to learn about freshwater and saltwater with us. We'd like to know what you think about today's virtual field trip, and you can let us know what you think by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC feedback and leaving us some feedback. We hope to see you during our next field trip for second graders. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.